I'm Beth Norcross. For those of you who don't know me, it's so great to see everyone. I direct the Center for Spirituality and Nature. Many of you know the center, but for those of you who don't, we offer opportunities for spiritual deepening in the natural world and encourage everyone to be more connected and in relationship, loving relationship with all the earth, including all of our human brothers and sisters, as well as our non-human brothers and sisters. I'm so pleased and privileged to be a part of this program this evening as we begin the conversation, right, Tykee? Begin the conversation of what role nature has to play and spirit has to play as we seek together justice and equity for all. So I'm going to uncharacteristically not say a lot, and I'll just move us right along. Let me just do a few little logistical things, housekeeping, and then we'll turn it over to our speakers. For those of you, I know we're all pretty familiar with Zoom these days, but for those of you who are not, we're going to be asking everyone to mute. If you would please, you can find that in the upper right-hand corner. And also in the far upper right-hand corner, you'll see something that says view. And you can turn that on gallery to see everyone's wonderful faces, or you can turn it to speaker view so that you can get a better look at our speakers. And I would endorse that view. So let me just very briefly introduce our speakers. Tykee James is the Government Affairs Coordinator for National Audubon, a long history with birding, and we're really looking forward to hearing from him. Corina Newsome just came out of the field where she's doing her master's studies in predation, nest predation for sea sparrows. How did I do, Corina?
Seaside sparrows.
Seaside sparrows. Seaside sparrows, my mistake, thank you. And Reverend Dr. Kip Banks, who's on the board of our center and also the pastor of East Washington Heights Baptist, is joining us as a moderator this evening. Reverend Banks has been involved in energy efficiency and all manner of environmental efforts as he links both ecology and faith. So we're so glad to have Reverend Banks and Tykee and Corina. Let me just very briefly go over the schedule and then I'll turn it over to Reverend Banks. We're going to hear from Tykee and Corina. I'm going to give brief presentations on the topic, and then Reverend Banks is going to moderate a discussion, a conversation with them. And we're hoping then at the end to have about 10 or 15 minutes to hear from you. We hope that there's a lively conversation going on in the chat, so feel free to chat if you have something to say. And we all are going to be gathering questions for this last period. So if you have a question, just chat away, either address it to the full group or to Abby Grothick, who's going to be collecting these for us, and we'll get to those at the end. So I'm going to turn myself on mute and turn it over to Reverend Dr. Banks.
Thank you, Beth. I am Kip Banks, pastor of the East Washington Heights Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., and I join Beth in welcoming you to His Eye is on the Sparrow, Blackbirding and Beyond. That title is taken from a beloved hymn of the church, and it's taken from the scripture in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, "Don't worry about tomorrow. Just as God watches over the sparrows, so he will watch over you." Some of you may think that black people and birding is an oxymoron, but it's actually not. And I'm just going to give a few quick anecdotes, and then we're going to hear our speakers. We know that I'm here in Washington, D.C., and our beloved Congressman John Lewis passed away on this past Friday. He was the conscience of the Congress. There's a new biopic about him called Good Trouble. And if you get a chance, I encourage you to view that biopic. And in that biopic, we see that John Lewis was a bird watcher. Early on, he was tending to chickens. Chickens are birds. And he started out preaching to the chickens. That was his inspiration. And so all through his life, he loves chickens. He in fact, in his home in the biopic, you see he collects he collects things about chickens because he loves chickens. That's one anecdote. Second anecdote is, when I was a little boy, I grew up in Los Angeles, California, but my mother's from Texas. And a bird flew in our house, and my mother was transfixed. Her grandmother had died. She said, "Grandmother is here." My mother believed that the bird that flew in our house represented her grandmother. And it was also true, finally, of my African American slave ancestors, that they looked to the birds for inspiration. There's a wonderful folk writer named Virginia Hamilton, and she writes a story about the people could fly, and the slaves certainly believed they would look at the birds and see the birds fly, and they in turn believed that they could fly. Even as it says in Isaiah 40, they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up on wings like an eagle. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint. That inspiration has long been there from African Americans watching birds, and it's so needed today as we deal with COVID-19 and increasing racial intolerance and all that we're going through. And that's why we're excited to have two fresh voices with us. We're going to share about how indeed watching these birds can bring us inspiration. It's all inspiration to make it in this dark and terrible time. And so we're going to hear from Tykee James, and then we're going to hear from Corina Newsome. And let's just wave our hands to welcome them to our conversation now. We are so happy to have them with us. Tykee.
That's what you said. Thank you so much for that. Very warm welcome. I feel like that was a good way to walk on stage with that level of excitement. I'm sitting down, everyone's sitting down, but you know what I mean. So my background, when I talk about birding and I talk about bird watching, I talk about my first job. When I was a senior in high school in Philadelphia, there were folks that were recruiting for this position to work at an environmental center in West Philly, Cobbs Creek, where you would learn about the environment and make money. And so the idea of learning while you earn was a simple concept, but one that I grasped very tightly when I was 17. And with that first job, I was able to have a cell phone and have a bike and, a sense of independence and, all that. But my first assignment when I was at the job was kind of like a book report. I was a part of a cohort of other docents, and it was kind of like a book report. They give you a species, you read up on it as much as you can. You look in your Petersons, you look in your Sibleys, you look, on the Audubon.org and the Crosley, wherever you need to look. And like a book report, you come back the next week to share your findings. For me, when I was coming back that next week, I got to see a belted kingfisher female on top of a cattail and saw it do its call as it crossed the creek. And that was a moment that, being so present for, I didn't know that it would be so rewarding later in life to see that was the moment that I started my path to conservation. And even then, a lot of my birding was in cities. I still watch birds primarily in Philadelphia. I live in DC. I'm in Long Island now, but I live in DC, and a lot of my birding is within city limits. I found a way to connect to nature through my job, and that was rewarding in those two ways, and that this is something that puts food on the table, and it gives me a reason to wake up earlier. It gives me a reason to go to sleep earlier because I want to wake up earlier to get those birds. So from that job I had for about 4.5 years. It was grant funded, so each year we got to reapply for the grant, and at the some point we just didn't, our renewal wasn't approved. So I got a new job, working in Parks and Rec, Philadelphia, doing very similar environmental education. Except this time it wasn't just with my neighbors in West Philadelphia. It was with children from all across the city of Philadelphia. And I got really exposed to how different age groups and different backgrounds can interact with nature. I mean, little kids are just full of excitement and creativity. So there's always something new to learn from their perspective. But that was my first time seeing that, if a school group that came from a predominantly Black school would come to the nature center and we would take a hike, the teachers would or even sometimes the students would be so disconnected from touching anything because they think, or because they don't know what, it could be that they're touching. It could be poison ivy, whatever it is. And seeing how that disconnect can be so easily broken when they see and they can reflect on what my relationship is to the environment, and they can see how I'm walking around and how I'm enjoying it. But I shifted from environmental education to environmental policy when, out of the blue, via Facebook, nobody calls anybody via Facebook, but the state representative, Donna Bullock, did for me. She was looking for a scheduler. She found that, somebody was cycling out of her office, and she saw that I was on Facebook complaining, about not having a job after being an environmental educator. When she saw my resume, she saw that I was an educator for so long, at that point. She offered me a job to advise her on environmental policy. And that was an opportunity I took very seriously because I helped build an agenda that gave her a profile of someone who is progressive for environmental justice and understands that a lot of environmental issues are connected, not just connected geographically through the watershed, but connected through decisions that have been made in history that have said, we're going to put resources here and we're not going to put resources there. We're going to make a red line on where we are going to invest and where we allow people to live. And on the other side, we'll make it a little better. And, demonstrating that, practice of learning and also making money at the same time was kind of the core of that job. And, it really helped me understand how important it is that folks have a voice when we're talking about how to solve some of these big problems that we're all dealing with. That job, opened up another door with the National Audubon Society, where they, asked me to move down to DC. And initially I was against that because living in North Philadelphia, being from North Philadelphia, I was not going to leave. Like, I felt like I just came back. I'm getting invested into the local environment, the friends groups, the environmental education centers all around the Philadelphia area. But I realized that my sense of community could grow. It could grow beyond a zip code or a city line or even a state. And having, worked with the National Audubon Society now for 2 years as their government affairs coordinator, I've realized how helpful it is to have a broad perspective on the different ways you can help people. And one of the ways that I help people most is hearing stories, honestly. And government affairs coordinator doesn't really sound like it, but I hear stories a lot and I tell those stories, or I have those stories inspire me. I specifically, when people really ask what I really do, I tell them that I am a bird lobbyist. And, everyone can imagine what a lobbyist is. It's the person who comes into the congressional office and like shakes down a staffer and is like, give me an answer. Is he going to protect the birds or not? And, typically they do want to protect the birds. But I don't do that. I'm not that mean. And also it's not necessary. It's birds. But what I do is I take folks out. I take members of Congress and congressional staff out on bird walks so that when we are walking on that path and having the experience to point at that bird and say, your vote on committee or your vote on the floor can protect this bird, not just this bird, but this experience, the one that we're sharing together today, but one that we would hope our grandchildren can enjoy tomorrow. And that's just a conversation you can't necessarily have over a table where you're talking about the offsets and the quavos and the approps bills, whatever that means. Having that experience is I think underlining the fact that everybody has a relationship to nature, and what that relationship means is very important when we think about the decisions that we make for the environment that we all share. I started in the environment. My connection started as a job, and it still is a job today. I think I would say most of the bird walks I've ever been on has been because of my job. It's because I have to be here. It didn't turn into a hobby until like later, but then I broke my ankle. So like it's part rehab, part hobby. It's part, I'll figure it out. But to my point about it starting as a job, I think that is also where a lot of folks see, and a lot of institutions have been reflective of this too, entry-level positions for people of color to diversify the workforce, the environmental workforce. I mean, I think that's a great start, but you got to hire middle, you got to hire top, you got to hire senior leadership level too. You know, you got to have the representative of your constituency, representative of your board. You know, I think that there's just like some base level understandings of how inclusivity can be demonstrated. But when I also think about, you know, jobs in that respect, I think about how jobs can change the culture of conservation. So when we are, you know, thinking about what these big questions are that we don't have the answers to, or maybe we feel like we have the answers to, I think that it's okay that we wrestle with the complications of some of those answers, of some of what that might mean. I mean, I think only recently did some of these big environmental organizations realize that they have to give up power to see the change that they want to see the change that they're working for. They're realizing that they're going to have to change internal policy in order to walk the walk that they are talking. And some are scared about that. Some are scared about the idea of, you know, losing power, whatever that means. I mean, I feel like I know what that means. I feel like you're attached to the status quo that says land theft, that says the legacy of environmental racism, that says anti-Black, you know, racist policies and white supremacy should be today and forever. I think that from a long time ago, we knew that that's not how it's supposed to be. That accountability is taking a lot of different forms, obviously. But it is a lot to say that Black Birders Week I strongly believe Black Birders Week had a role in contributing to the movement of not just inclusivity in the environmental space, but justice in entering, you know, and addressing things to reduce less harm, as a way to advance environmental progress.
Great. Thank you for that awesome beginning. And you covered much ground. And we're going to have a time for some dialogue. And now we're going to hear from Corina Newsome, and then we're going to begin to ask some questions. And think in advance that you may have some questions, and you can put them in the chat section down at the bottom. Corina.
All right, thank you so much for having me again, Beth and Reverend Banks. Thank you for the great introduction. I also am from Philadelphia, so me and Tykee have that in common. I'm from Northwest Philly in Germantown, so the Illadel in the house. I grew up in the city, and I was probably I grew up in the hood, but it probably had more green than most hoods in Philadelphia, right? There were some streets had a couple trees on them. That was about it though. But I grew up being really attached to and obsessed with, and in a kind of an academic way, with nature. I had so many books that my family provided me, magazines, picture books, encyclopedias that I was just paging through and kind of building this incredible attachment to the idea of biodiversity, which I didn't conceptualize back then, but I loved the idea that there were so many species of so many different taxa around the world, none of which I had seen, but I was excited at the prospect of seeing them one day. And because we didn't have a lot of like natural space near our home, my mom would take me and my younger sister out to the suburbs, sometimes to private property to go exploring. None of us knew what we were looking at, but we were outside, and that was important to her, and it has become important to me. And so growing up, you know, I would have these chance kind of encounters with the natural world through my mother. But ultimately, I didn't know what it looked like to put that passion into a career, right? So what was familiar to me was like veterinary medicine, which is, I think, familiar to a lot of young people. So that's kind of the path I took until one day a zookeeper at the Philadelphia Zoo, which is me and Tykee's home zoo, she was actually the lead carnivore keeper at the Philadelphia Zoo, but I didn't know that at first. A family friend of mine, who was her sister, he told me, he was like, hey, my sister, she works at the Philadelphia Zoo. You should reach out to her and see if she can help you. And my first thought was, she probably works in concessions. And it wasn't until I was an adult and reflected on that moment in retrospect retrospect that I realized how impactful the fact that I had never seen a Black person doing any kind of wildlife job had the impact that had had on me. Okay, so I ended up reaching out to her. She ended up exposing me to the very career that I'm in today. I would not be here had she not exposed me to herself doing the job and to the career path itself. Now, at the same time, I grew up in the church, still in the church, you know, love the Lord, a follower of Jesus. But not only did I not have any Black scientists in my life, I didn't have any scientists who were Christians in my life. I didn't know what it looked like to study the natural world, to study science, study biology, and to be a person of faith. And because of that, I assumed that those two realities were in direct opposition to each other. And that was what my worldview looked like all the way until I got to college. I figured that, you know, the Bible, which is the scriptural text that I use, was in contradiction to anything that I would learn in science. I actually ended up going to a Christian university, which if you had asked me if I would do that as a kid, I would say absolutely not. Like, because of my understanding of faith and science, I thought that a Christian university couldn't possibly teach science well. You know, I was like, they're going to ignore science. They're not going to teach about evolution. They're going to teach me six-day creation and I won't know anything. I had all these preconceptions. I ended up going to a Christian university because they had the best wildlife zoo science program that I could find. Ended up going, and that was the place where I realized and I experienced for the first time ever that my faith and my science complement each other in ways I could not have imagined. And in fact, realizing that and being able to look critically at my faith and look critically at my science at the same time allowed my science and my faith both to be enriched. And at that point, I began to be able to see patterns in my faith that were reflected in the natural world and patterns in the natural world that were reflected in my faith, and allow those two parts of my reality to inform each other. And that has made my experience personally much richer, but also has given me skills and the ability to interact with people who don't trust science, or who you know, are anti-faith, people who also had the worldview that I had at one point, that the two cannot interact with each other and that they are in direct opposition with one another. And so the combination of being introduced to people who look like me, being introduced to career fields that I would have imagined I could be in, and people who thought critically about faith, people who had a faith, were able to produce a worldview that I now have that essentially allows me to do all of those things much more fully and richly, and to be able to have discussions like this. So I'm excited to be able to talk about kind of the intersection of identity and experience in the outdoors, particularly as it relates to Black identity and spirituality. So thank you.
Thank you both for those very powerful introductory statements. And I just want to ask some questions, and I'll ask Beth if she wants to ask some too. And then we're going to open it up to everyone to ask a question. First question I want to ask is, certainly our title is Birding While Black. And so the question is, what has your experience been like as a person of color while birding? And do you imagine that the experience is different for those who are not? And I'll start. Go ahead, Tykee. Yeah.
Oh, I was about to say, I wonder how many Corina and I have in common. Corina, have you ever been called a rare bird?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. All right. So that's one. Okay, actually, no, you try to do one now.
Oh, I'm trying to think. That's tough, Tykee. I'm not, you can't like that.
I was about to say, well, okay, so part of the experience, at least from one of the discussions that we had on Facebook, on National Audubon Society's Facebook, on this exact question of birding while black, some of the answers were along the lines of, being mistaken for another black birder. I haven't been before, because most of the other black birders that they know are much, much older than me. So I don't, there's no confusion there, but, I don't know. Is it different for you, Corina?
No. So my experience is the same, mainly because black people who are birding tend to be so spread out, so it's like most of the white people who I interact with have never seen someone who's black and birding.
Rare bird.
Yeah, a rare, exactly. Yep.
Somebody said that to me in an email the other day. I was just like, you know what? I'm going to use this as a joke at another point in time, and I'm glad I used it here. One experience too, and something that, is worth highlighting, I think, is, as a birder, as a Black man that's also a birder, I know that, I haven't gone bird walk. Like one of the big reasons that I don't do personal bird walks, most of the reasons that I do bird walks when I'm doing it for work, is like my sense of control to some extent, but then also predictability. Like I just feel like I can explain myself better if I'm working and I'm doing a bird walk versus if I'm just out trying to enjoy myself and doing just watching birds, I guess. I definitely feel that I don't have the liberty to take that luxury of like, oh, I'm just gonna go on a bird walk versus I'm gonna go lead a bird walk. Is I feel more safe doing that from the birding point of view.
Yeah, I would say that, and Tykee, you can jump in on this as well, like the experience that a Black person has while birding is, in my opinion, the experience that Black people have doing almost anything. There is a certain kind of posture or a certain frame of mind that you have when you enter any space, whether it's alone or in a group, whatever the context might be. And some of the themes of that posture are, how do I make myself look like I belong? How do I make myself look non-threatening? And it doesn't matter if you're exploring the outdoors recreationally looking for birds, or if you're someone just outside, if you're in a supermarket, if you're in a Starbucks, it doesn't matter where you are. There's a certain level of having to make sure you are accounting for the comfortability of the white people in the room or in the space. And that in itself is an energy taxing experience. And I've been hearing this phrase used a lot, the Black tax. Have you heard that being used recently? And that the Black tax is contributed to by so many different parts of our experience. But as a Black woman, that is one of them, trying to make sure that I look like I'm supposed to be here. And I want to say that as a lighter skinned Black woman, my actual experience and the way that people treat me is different than a darker toned Black person. And I want to say that because colorism is a thing, and one's proximity to whiteness benefits you. And so the darker you are, the harder of a time a lot of people tend to have just existing in majority white spaces. And so I want to make sure I say that because it's very much true. So that's kind of my experience when it comes to birding. And as a bird scientist, so I do birding recreationally, where I go outside and I look for birds, but I also study birds as part of my master's program, as part of my job, my work. And so I always want to make sure that I look official. You know what I mean? It's like looking official should be the last thing on my mind, right?
Yeah,
it's horribly hot in Georgia's marshes where I'm doing my work. I'm always dehydrated. Like I should just kind of be focused on survival and collecting data. But in addition to that, I'm also, again, thinking about the way people perceive me when they see me from the road outside in the marsh. Do I look like I'm trespassing? Do I look like someone who's doing something suspicious? And so I do things to at least try to stave that off in as many ways as I can.
Yeah, I feel that. And I think that me doing or having it as a job has been one of my like barriers for that. Like where I'm like, oh, this feels legitimate because there's a flyer. Like I feel safe because at the end of the day, I'm supposed to be here. I said, it's on Facebook, like I just feel like that's what I would show a cop if a cop were to stop me. That's what I'm always thinking about.
Yeah, it certainly is a sad commentary of our times, the racial bifurcations and the separation and the hatred and animosities. It's a tone that's been set overall in our nation that is not very pleasant. And it's just so sad to see in just everyday, ordinary circumstances. Even the experience of Christian Cooper, who is in Central Park, just trying to bird and then being accosted simply because he's a Black man. Do you think the natural world can be a point of connection or relationship between different races, or are our experiences just too different?
You should start that one, Corina. You got it.
That's a good question. I think that our experiences certainly are different, right? And so you want to give honor to that and make sure that you are aware of that and operate under that assumption, because it's true. Our experiences are different, but I don't believe that they are too different that it's impossible for us to come together around outdoor exploration. And in fact, I think outdoor exploration, especially birding, is an activity that unites people very quickly. I've noticed that in all of my academic spaces, except most recently, there is one other Black person in my program now. In all of my other academic spaces and in birding spaces, I've typically been the only Black person there. And there are, as I mentioned, because of the Black tax that I experience and that I know other Black people experience, there is an amount of there's a level of like a draining sensation that comes from being the only one. But at the same time, when you see a male painted bunting, right, the electricity that flows through the group, no matter who you are, no matter the inequities that may exist between your experiences as far as injustice in the outdoors, the moment you see that painted bunting, there's this unifying excitement. And because birds are everywhere, right? They're everywhere. They're in such great diversity. It is an incredible way to bring people into united joy very quickly. And I think joy is a powerful energy, and birding does that for me. And you know, even in all the all-white birding spaces or diverse birding spaces that you enter, there's so much joy. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's a great unifying activity.
Great.
And I want to retweet that, but also retweet it with a comment that Corina said before, and that is birding is a hope-giving activity. And the fact that barriers exist for people to enrich in that experience or enrich in that hope gathering, like that should be upsetting to all, but we should definitely think about more responsibly what we can do to eradicate those barriers and build more bridges. You know, maybe we actually don't even need new infrastructure. Maybe we just have a level playing field of some sort, you know, so that everyone can enjoy birding.
One more quick question, and I'm going to turn it over to Beth for a question, and I'm also going to ask you all to put your questions in the chat. And I love that statement, Tykee, that birding is a hope-building activity.
Well, that's Corina. You loved it from Corina. I've seen her in the news a lot lately, so I've just been reading. You know? That's an awesome statement. I found that to be true. I have a 15-year-old son, and he's like most teenagers. He loves playing on his Xbox. So I have to, as wanting to be a responsible father, I have to work really hard to get him off the Xbox. Well, during this quarantine, I'm an amateur birder, and so I have a bird feeder, and I have some, goldfinches and chickadees, and cardinals. Just an amateur birder. And okay, so hello.
One day, I cut his video game off, and he was out in front of the house looking out the window, and he became transfixed. He said, "Wow, Dad, it's not so bad looking at these birds after all." And he began to feed the birds. And so the quick question is, even out of the trauma and the turmoil of what happened to Christian Cooper, with your movement, do you see the possibility of more African Americans, in particular young people, adopting birding as a way of bringing hope to our communities and to our world?
Yes.
Do you see?
You want to go first?
I was gonna say yes, but I'm sure I want Corina, you can take a swing.
Okay, cool. Certainly. And so, one of the points I want to make that I've talked to Tykee about before, and that I thought of just now. There seems to be a pattern, and this is going to get back to your question, Reverend Banks. I've noticed a pattern a lot of times kind of originating in white spaces where nature, the wilderness, you could say, is kind of treated as a consumable item to bring peace, right? It's this place where you can go and it's serene, it's calm. You go there, you breathe in some fresh air, and then you go back to your life, right? You don't people are uncomfortable with the idea of brutality and the I guess the parts of nature that they don't bring peace. They don't bring calm, right? It's easy to have a perspective of nature that looks at it and goes, oh, this is really serene, right? But if you look closely at nature, you see that there is, in fact, a lot of brutality. There's a lot of pain in the natural world. There is a lot of suffering that happens by creatures of all species. I've seen that same selective encountering with nature, that kind of pattern be reflected in the way that people understand their interactions with other people. So it's more palatable to understand society and the things happening around you as serene and as calm and as peaceful and as everything is okay. Meanwhile, ignoring the brutality that people are experiencing, the inequities that people are experiencing, because it's easier to look away and focus your attention on the things that make you comfortable. That pattern, I think, is one of the structures, essentially, that has become a structure that pushes Black people out. And one of the things that I noticed during Black Birders Week was there was a lot of resistance from white birders and white outdoor enthusiasts to address this issue because it makes them uncomfortable. Birding should just be about birds, right? Well, unfortunately, there's an entire history that Black people have in this country that's not comfortable, that's not palatable, that's not fun to look at, that's brutal, and that has to be acknowledged because that informs and impacts our experiences outside. The hope that Black Birders Week gave me is that it essentially put right in front of people's faces the experiences of human beings, of Black human beings that they've chosen to ignore for so long, and that they censored out to maintain their own comfort. And so the hope that I have is that Black people are no longer going to be censored. They're not going to feel like if they want to go birding, if they want to go exploring outside, if they want to be part of these communities, that they have to essentially cut out the part of themselves that makes the white people in this space uncomfortable. No, they can bring their whole self to the table. And I think that one of the reasons why that's happening is because our stories have been essentially plastered all over the internet, but we've also been able to come into contact with other Black people who share our experiences and we can feel affirmed. So that, thank you, Tykee, I needed all that energy. So the combination of all that is to say that, yes, I have hope, because for the first time in a while, Reverend Banks, people are listening and believing the stories of Black people, listening to Black people, and in fact, inviting us to tell our stories, which is so important because our stories have been censored out for so long.
Amen. Wonderful, wonderful. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Beth to see if she has a question, and then we'll open it up to everyone. And I see some have already entered some questions in the chat, and we'll get to your questions. And so, Beth, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. There is a lively conversation going on in the chat. Corina, just playing off of that, I really heard what you were saying about this, the violence. There's violence at the heart of nature that we like to ignore. We like to go out there and breathe and smell and come back and feel better about things. But as you said, nature is at its heart violent. And in Black history has also been violent. So and we must not ignore that. And I hear that and I honor that and I thank you for that. Along those same lines, a question that I had was, what is it, can we learn from these processes within the natural systems if we take a good, hard, long look at them? When we first met, you were reading Corinthians and thinking about diversity in nature and the importance of diversity in nature. You've told us a minute ago about the importance of honoring the violence at the heart of both nature and your history. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what you are finding in the natural world in terms of the ecological processes that you think would be helpful to this moment?
So that's a great question, Beth. Thank you. What I'm noticing, so as we kind of said before, I do research on a species called the Seaside Sparrow. And this is a bird that lives in coastal marshes, all right? And the coast, any coastal ecosystem, any organisms living on coasts, human communities living on coasts, are particularly vulnerable to climate change, to this particular threat called climate change. And these vulnerable ecosystems and the species that inhabit them while they are the most vulnerable and going to experience the impacts of climate change, this particular threat, most immediately and most quickly, those are some of our most important ecosystems. They buffer the rest of the inland habitats, inland communities of people, inland creatures from storms, from hurricanes, right? We need these ecosystems. One of the things that I'm learning is that in the same way that a lot of conservation action, money, research, part of which I am participating in, that's being dedicated to these ecosystems, we're doing it because they are the most vulnerable. We have to have that same perspective when it comes to problem solving for people. And I'm not here to draw, I'm not trying to draw like a dichotomy between helping people, helping wildlife. Like we are part of the same system, right? But the same logic that we apply to where we put our resources when it comes to preparing the natural world and doing whatever we can to mitigate threats, we have to apply that same problem solving to people. The people who are most vulnerable in our society are the people who have been under oppression since the inception of this country, right? Indigenous people, people of African descent who were dragged over, kidnapped, brought here, forced to build the country. These people and other marginalized communities in this country, these people are the most vulnerable. And a society that continues to oppress certain people is not at its best, right? It's not at its healthiest. When the society is equitable, whether it's a community of people, an organization, or a society is equitable, everybody benefits. When the people who have been oppressed benefit, everybody benefits. In the same way that we are protecting coastlines and we are protecting endangered species and we're extending extra energy to make sure they don't go extinct, to protect them, we need to do the same for vulnerable groups of people. And the reason we need to do that is because homogeneity is dangerous, right? And one of the things that you kind of brought up, Beth, in the description was that when you have a monoculture, right, whether it's in the natural world, in a particular ecosystem, if you have nothing but raccoons, you're in trouble. If you have nothing but vultures, you're in trouble. If you got nothing but leopards, you're in trouble, no matter what it is, right? In the same way, if you have a group of people and you have nothing but the same kind of person, so to speak, so like similar backgrounds, similar experience in society, similar perspectives on life, you're going to be much less capable of problem solving, right? And in this place where we are today, where we are facing so many deep problems, we need to be at the maximum capacity for problem solving. And to do that, we have to be bringing the most vulnerable people, the people who are not part of this majority who have ruled the money and the power, they need to be at the table so that we can problem solve. Same reason why you got to protect the coast. So that's kind of the intersection between what I've been seeing in nature and what I know to be true about people in this time.
Excellent. Yeah, I want to get some of the questions from our participants. And a couple of questions are kind of related. One is from Margot Lehman, and Margot says, "What can white bird enthusiasts do to help black birders feel safer?" And I'm going to go to YouTube first, Tykee, and a second question kind of related to that one. And that one is, this is from Jim Lorison. It says, with such brutal history and the attention that you need to give it, such as not even wanting to go birding alone, how do you control your anger and mourn your loss? What can white birders do to help black birders? And then the other one is, how do you control your anger and mourn your loss?
Well, I don't know if I speak for everybody when I say this, but I am always angry. I am always in mourning. But I still find a reason to get up. I think that there's a lot of reasons why, and I think there's a lot of reasons why I have that fight. I think some of it is just like my Philly spirit. I'm just gonna fight. Like if there's a problem, we can fight. That can be a solution. I don't think that is so far away from a solution. And when I say fight, it's not always violent. On the question of what can white birders do, though, so. Like I said, I was recruited from a high school, predominantly black high school, to this program that was managed by two white dudes. These two white dudes taught me everything I know about birding, a lot of what I know about the environment, and made me very comfortable with talking to white people about race, because they were very open in talking about it. One of the reflections that they had recently, you know, so many years after that program, and the youth that we met through it, was how they feel responsible for exposing them to racism, to direct racial profiling, to direct discrimination and slurs. That, you know, when his idea was to get a bus and take all these kids from Philly to Cape May to meet Richard Crosley, and, you know, at the big day, like, that was what the day was about. But what it became about was making a Wawa stop, and, you know, the students walking in, looking for something, thinking about getting food, and then somebody accosts them and says, "Are you going to buy something? I think you're going to steal something." You know, and like, now that's the day. The day isn't about the birds. The day is about that mourning and that anger. Reconciling that is perhaps a first step, but that's not a position that everybody's in. Not everyone is in a position to lead bird walks. And again, like I said, this was a job. So I always think about birding, for the most part, I think about birding from the perspective of an organization or an institution organizing a bird walk and doing it to execute a mission of some sort. So I'm also on the board of directors of 2 different chapters for the Audubon Society. And this is often the question that I get to some extent. And this is the similar answer that I provide, that, you know, one is reconciling that unless you're doing anti-racist things, you're not helping at all. 1, 2, knowing that you are complacent in this, you know, in ways that you can control, and there's ways that you can't control, that you're complacent in this. And, you know, 3, paying for expertise, because I don't have all the answers. I'm just a board member who cares about birds. I'm actually a lobbyist. I don't actually know how to exactly manage a nonprofit, but it definitely is, you know, on the question of like, what can I do? There's an individual answer, there's an institutional answer to those 2 questions. And you got to realize how, you know, which way are you operating? Because if it's individual, I think some of those answers might go to be a decent human, you know. But when it comes down to the institutional answer, that answer gets a little more complicated, because now we want to look at, well, what does your mission say? And then what have you done? You know, I want to look at, what have your funders funded and what have you done with those funds? You know, that's, you know, when you get institutional, that's when you start to really see clearly how inequity has a certain honing for minorities and people who are already marginalized, so that when you think that you're helping them, no, you're actually furthering the oppression. You're just doing it in a really neat way. So it is an interesting question, but one that can have a different answer if you're an individual versus acting as an institution.
You want to add anything, Corina?
The one thing that I would add, kind of on the individual level, is to, and I've been saying this a lot recently, is to kind of abolish the expectation that any of these spaces are neutral spaces. Kind of getting to what I said before about the ignoring the suffering that makes you uncomfortable. Can't do that. And that actually furthers to exclude people who are already oppressed. So in your spaces, whether you're a birder or you're a financial advisor, whatever you are doing, whatever space you are in, it is likely that the oppressed people groups are having a different experience and have had a different experience than you, and don't censor those experiences out. And if you see someone else censoring the experience of Black people or of other oppressed people, hold them accountable to that and change the culture that censors oppressed people's experiences.
Yeah.
We have about 8 minutes left, and I'm going to ask a quick question of you both. Corina Glasshill had a very challenging question. I'm not going to ask that one because it's challenging, and I think it'll take more than 8 minutes to answer that question. But I'm going to ask a quick question, and I'm going to turn it back to Beth for any final questions and to wrap it up. And so my final question is, how do we get young people, and this is a question actually coming from Radina S. How do we get young people interested in birds, or for that matter, just about any nature-oriented activity? And I'm listening for myself because I have a young person.
Tykee, do you mind before I lose this thought, because I just had a thought come to me. So the thing that I think about, or what I think about typically, what I've been thinking about a lot, is that you hear people say like, oh, like Black kids or kids in the city or certain kinds of kids aren't as interested in sciences or exploration, and that's simply not true. You know, if you take kids who are like 5, 6 years old and you survey their interests, you're going to find similar proportions across ethnic groups, across socioeconomic groups when it comes to interest in exploration, interest in science or STEM. But as they grow, society tells them things are not for them, and that dies off. So what I would encourage you to do is, if you are around young kids, so before they're youth, right? If you're around young kids, encourage those passions. Discourage any images, anything they see that tells them it's not for them, and give them images that tell them that it is for them. So if you're a teacher, don't just keep showing all white scientists in your slideshows. Go out of their way and look for Black scientists, look for Latinx scientists. You know what I mean? Like, diversify what you're showing kids, you know, so that once they get to be teenagers, they have not constructed this image in their head that it's not for them. That's what happened to me. But to get people interested in birding, I think you have to be willing to share your passion. So share your excitement. So you're not just sharing information. If you know individuals, I think that the most powerful way to make it happen is to use your interpersonal connections, your relationships, your neighbor, you know, family, friend, whatever. Use those interpersonal relationships you have and share your excitement about whatever it is, birding in this case, whatever it might be, because excitement is much more contagious than information by itself.
Great. Tykee?
Oh, I was gonna just say make it cool, but I like Corina's answer.
That's a great answer. Great answer.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Yeah. So now we turn it back over to Beth to wrap up in the way that she would choose to do so.
Well, I have one more question actually, and then I'll just do a quick wrap up at the end. What a privilege to be in this moment, learning so much. My question is, you know, we are the Center for Spirituality and Nature, and I'm wondering if you all could speak briefly to whether this sense of the divine mystery or spirit or God or whatever we call that, entwined in the natural world, in its peacefulness and in its violence, in all of it, can play a role as we confront this systemic racism that we're all becoming just a little more aware of these days.
You know, I think that what my religious teachings, what my religious background has taught me is that the answer is a journey, you know, versus bird watching, where the answer is as soon as you look at it, you might know, you might not. And then perhaps maybe then the answer is a journey to see what it is in the Sibley. But in the longer term of things, I see that the answer is always a journey that I've always been interested in taking. And those big questions about what do we do to solve racism? How do we upend white supremacy? How do we, you know, have value in this life, knowing that all of this terrible stuff made all of this possible? I think taking that journey is something I would encourage a lot of folks to do, especially young folks. I think young people have been exposed to things in ways that I haven't when I was younger, that I feel like I can talk to them about things, and whether or not they can articulate it like I can, I'm not going to put value on. What I'm going to put value on is the fact that we can carry this kind of conceptual conversation about what things can and should be. And yeah, I feel good on that.
Yeah. Thanks, Tykee.
The thing that I think about, so Drew Lanham, who is a Black birder and bird biologist, who was like my hero, right? He gave this image that was very powerful to me, and this is kind of the way that I feel like, I guess if you want to say the spirit of God or whatever, however you conceptualize that, at like reflecting what we should be doing and what it should look like for us to move in unity in this time, is the image of migration, right? So migration is this extremely taxing, extremely dangerous journey, Tykee, that billions and billions of birds go on like twice a year, right? So many birds are flying over open ocean for days on end, big and small. So you have like little hummingbirds, right, flying over the Gulf of Mexico. You have large, you know, hawks and raptors, but you have this incredible diversity of birds. And when it comes to North America, we have like 300 species maybe migrating. They are in every, like, as much diversity as you can imagine. They're all moving in the same direction. They're facing the same challenges together. Of course, birds are not necessarily conceptualizing this, right? But the image is you have every kind of bird you can imagine moving north or moving south, but moving together and in the same direction, facing the same challenges together at the same time. And I think that kind of conceptualized unity is what we need. We need every kind of person facing all the same challenges together and moving in the same direction at the same time in order to accomplish what the magnitude of change that needs to happen, that needs to go really deep and for a long time. So that's kind of the way that I think about it. Again, J. Drew Lanham, incredible poet, incredible thinker. That imagery is courtesy to him.
Well, thank you for that, Corina and Tykee, and thank you so much for your openness, your vulnerability, your willingness to bring your whole selves to us in this moment. When I was first talking to Tykee about this, he said, Beth, you've got to impress upon folks that this is just the beginning of this conversation. And I, for one, can tell you that I would love to have you back to continue this conversation in so many different ways. Lots and lots of thank yous in the chat room. It's really been such a privilege to be with you both in this moment. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. And Reverend Banks, thank you for moderating so well. And we look forward to hearing more from you and seeing you again. We'll be posting this. We have recorded it. I, for one, need to listen to it again and want to listen to it again. For those who are participating, thank you so much for all of your engagement in this. And you'll be hearing from us with a link to the recording and link to other things that are going on through the center. So I wish you all a very good night. And I cannot express how appreciative I am of you both.